Hi, my name is Ahmed Suwadi and welcome to my presentation on critical analysis of complex training in strength and power in performance development for the module SAC 7105 Program Design, Planning and Monitoring in Strength and Conditioning, St. Mary's University. I will start by providing a general overview of the presentation. First, I will start by explaining what is complex training, and then I will go through the main key components that characterize complex training, their characteristics, and their demands during this training method. I will then provide a summary on how, when is best to implement complex training. As a clarification, before going into complex training, I think it's important to be able to understand the difference between complex training, contrast training, and APS training, or agonist-antagonist paired set, as these methods have been used or mixed and can be confusing sometimes. Duthie et al. 2002 defined contrast training as alternating between heavy load and light load during exercise, or basically contrasting the load. And Carter and Greenwood 2014 described agonist-antagonist paired set training method as simply using the complex training style under the form of a pair of agonist-antagonist exercise. The same study mentioned that there is difference between this method and the complex training method, simply for the simple reasons that the movements are not similar and the muscles involved are not the same. So moving on to complex training, what is it exactly? Firstly, complex training have been developed with the idea to utilize or maximize the effect of post-activation potentiation. We will talk about this aspect later on in this presentation. So complex training as a definition, Kobako et al. 2014 described it as a combination between high load exercise with plyometric exercise. Stasinaki et al. 2015 defined complex training as a combination between high resistance strength exercise and a biomechanically similar lower load high speed exercise. So following these two definitions, we can say that complex training method is alternating strength and power exercises set to set within the same workout. General example, for example, alternating between back squat as a high load exercise with the jump squat as an explosive or plyometric exercise, which is biomechanically similar to the back squat. For complex training, Kobako et al. 2014 reported that numerous studies found that complex training method had a positive impact in strength, power, and performance development. This has been confirmed later on by a meta-analysis study on adaptation following complex training in team sports by Freitas et al. 2019. Other studies compared complex training with other traditional training models or training methods. For example, a study by McDonald et al. 2012 compared the difference between resistance training, plyometric training, and complex training. And the results showed that the three methods had an improvement in strength, but there is no significant difference between them and no deterioration in performance. The study suggested that complex training would be a viable training method and offers variation and time efficiency, and it should be incorporated into the athlete's power periodized protocol. However, a study by Shan et al. 2017 actually didn't recommend complex training in team setting, as they found that despite the positive impact of complex training, some athletes have actually deteriorated in performance or decreased performance. The study suggested that this drop in performance can be related to the element of fatigue, and that the athletes didn't have the sufficient amount of recovery time they needed. So from this point, we can identify that there is a possibility of coexistence between post-activation potentiation and fatigue at the same time. So moving on to the key components of complex training. When looking at complex training, we can identify four key elements. First is the post-activation potentiation. Second is strength training or the heavy resistance load. Third, plyometric or power training. And fourth, the intra-complex rest interval. So what is exactly post-activation potentiation? Again, the main idea behind complex training is to utilize post-activation potentiation to enhance performance. Cleary and Cook 2020 defined it as the increase of rate of muscular force development from myogenic and neuromuscular mechanisms. This can be from an elevation in phosphorylation of myosin light chain, or an increase in calcium sensitivity, or enhancement in motor neuron excitability. This can be under the form of motor unit recruitment, synchronization, and Wallace et al. 2019 suggested that muscle and neural factors are key elements in post-activation potentiation. So how can this post-activation potentiation be activated? Across the literature, studies have shown that post-activation potentiation can be activated with heavy load. For example, Kramer et al. 2004, they reported that a load greater than 80 or 85% of 1 rep max are needed to produce greater neural adaptation during advanced resistance training. Cleary and Cook 2020 suggested that in a complex training method, the use of a high load in resistance exercise is needed for the activation of the post-activation potentiation. And it should be over 80% of 1 rep max and around 3 to 5 repetitions. However, some studies, for example, Freitas et al. 2019, showed that complex training using loads lower than maximal and submaximal loads have shown improvement in strength without compromising sprint and jump performance. But the training method can be questioned, as they simply used modified complex training method with the use of a moderate and optimal load, which is likely for me to be more similar to contrast training method than complex training, as they are just alternating the load of the exercise. Carter and Greenwood 2014 reported that the National Strength and Conditioning Association recommended to train strength and power at loads over 70% and over 85% of 1 rep max, and a rest of 2 to 5 minutes is needed and recommended between sets. From this point, moving on to the power exercise or plyometric and explosive exercise, a study by Bogdanis et al. 2018 suggested that muscle power, or the rate of force development, can improve with the utilization of a wide range of training loads and methods. For example, a high load of over 85% of 1 rep max, low load with the intention to perform the exercise as fast as possible, ballistic programs, plyometric training, or a combination of these methods. From this description, we can identify that muscle power development can be a common point between the explosive or the plyometric training and the heavy load resistant training in the complex training method. So it's only a common sense that this method seems to improve strength without compromising power and performance. This suggestion can be valid, in my opinion, only if the element of fatigue is taken out of the equation, as power exercise should be performed in a fatigue-free state. And this leads us to the following key point, which is the intra-complex rest interval. So what is the intra-complex rest interval? A review paper by Carter and Greenwood 2014, they described it as the time between the high load exercise and the plyometric or the power exercise. The same paper reported that optimal time needed between strength and power exercise during complex training was around 4 minutes. However, Bevan et al. 2009 reported that the optimal recovery time to optimize the utilization of post-activation potentiation is around 8 to 12 minutes. If we go into more details on this study also found that 58% of the subjects had a greater response around the 8-minute recovery time, and the remaining 42% of their subjects had a greater performance at around 4 minutes, 12 minutes, and even at 16 minutes interval. This simply shows that the recovery needed depends on the individual ability, or how fast can the athlete recover. and as strength and conditioning professionals, we should determine the recovery time needed for each individual before implementing complex training. This suggestion is in agreement with the study by Cummins et al. 2006 that investigated the rest intervals in complex training. They determined that the recovery time is dependent on the athlete and should be calculated, which can be challenging and time-consuming in team sports or group setting. In summary, there is no clear or precise information on complex training method, but the findings and the combination of the information gathered, complex training should be as such. So performing a high load resistance exercise of over 80 to 85 or 85% of 1 rep max, and will need a rest between 2 to 5 minutes. It is best to perform power exercise in a fatigue-free state. So there is no clear on the optimal time window for post-activation potentiation, but studies suggest that the window of the post-activation potentiation should last up to 8 and even up to 12 minutes. There are some common points regarding optimal rest interval, despite the different results. Some studies found that 4 minutes had the highest effect, while others found similar results around 8 minutes and 12 minutes markers. So I would suggest that the intercomplex rest interval should be between 4 and 12 minutes, while keeping in mind that every individual is different and the time needed differs from an individual to another. If we are not careful and try to determine the time needed for recovery, then performance might be compromised due to the element of fatigue. So a few questions here. First, it has been recommended to implement complex training into periodized protocol or even into power program during in season. So taking this into consideration, the need to determine the recovery period for each athlete before implementing this method, can actually this be considered as time efficient? And also taking into consideration the adaptation of the athlete and improvement or even deterioration in physical strength and performance, it should be logical to think that the recovery needed can also change over time. So how often do we need to track the athlete's recovery time during a training program in order to prescribe this method? Will it be more time consuming over time? And finally, is the time needed for the lower body recovery similar to the time needed for the upper body recovery within the same individual? Thank you for watching. And,